vibration, raise the vibratory rate of those people that have come to listen, to just be part of all of this. And that happens through a series of what we call overtones that raises us to that spiritual level, what we just experienced with Crow's music. So when a string is plucked, when one of his strings is plucked, the note he's plucking is a fundamental, is what we call it. And then there are other notes that are also sounded, that you're hearing and may just not necessarily recognize, but you're hearing them because they're harmonics or overtones. And there's a legend that before there was a spoken word, there was harmonic language, before words were even words. And so today I want to give you a little bit of a meditation with the quartz crystal bowls that ties into all of this. We're going to start with silence. And I think most of you are used to doing meditation. And if you want to start with your feet flat on the ground and your hands in a comfortable place, and we start with silence and just that inner sound and those outer sounds that are just the ambient inside and outside of us. And then in a moment, after we bear ourselves in that silence for a moment, then each of the bowls is going to sing, and what I'm going to suggest that you begin listening to the physical aspects of the sound and be aware of the harmonics, and then listen a little deeper and let yourself become one with what you're hearing. And then we'll end again in silence. everything that exists in the universe was first thought. That thought then manifesting as word, a sound, which builds all forms, and itself is manifested in the life within those forms. Take a deep breath. And move into where we're at right here and now. Is everybody back? That was fun. Okay. Put these things away. So, I don't get a chance to speak too often. I don't want to speak too often, honestly. It takes a lot of work, doesn't it, for those who've done some of these talks, for sure. But this was an interesting topic to me. I used to think that the way to get along with those that you don't agree with was just to avoid them. And maybe some of you have thought about that as well. Marita, we talked about this, didn't we? Yes. Or at the very least, avoid the topics of disagreement. I think we all try to do it that way. But that doesn't always work, I've learned. And every day we encounter those who we disagree with a lot. And there's so much disagreement over things. It could be disagreement over religion or freedom and what the definition of there it is. It could be disagreement over what is truth and what is science and what's the good future for our community or our country. It could be disagreement over money or how to spend it. Conservative versus liberal, all of these things that we disagree with all the time. If you take any of these topics, I guarantee that most of us is going to have a bias in one direction or another. Would you agree with that? Mm-hmm. Yeah? Okay. And when I say bias is really a prejudice in favor of or against a person or a group compared to another. We don't want to say, well, we're prejudiced, but that's what bias is, and that's being honest with ourselves. We all have our biases. And we usually feel pretty strong about at least some of our biases. Some of them are more just tendencies and preferences. We all have some biases that we feel pretty strongly about, those shoulds in our lives. And those are the things that separate us too, aren't they? Can separate us from family, can separate us from members of our community. Bias can also keep us away sometimes from different kinds of experiences or interesting places or new people. And you might just say, hell yeah, I don't want to have anything to do with them. I'm happy with my bias. I don't want to see those new experiences or places or people or even have conversations about these things because it's painful. And it just brings out maybe not just the best in them, but not the best in us as well. But maybe there's another way, instead of just avoiding. Last month, I was reading an article, and it's in this book, it's in this magazine. It's called Tricycle. It's a Buddhist journal, and I've been getting it for years. And this particular article was by a Buddhist teacher out of Australia, and his name is Khentrul Rinpoche, and he wrote about a thing called Rime philosophy. It's spelled R-I-M-E. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. He said that Rime is about having a mind free of bias. It's a particular attitude that helps people work with diversity in a way that supports both your personal development as well as trying to promote greater harmony amongst the people that we're dealing with. that hold different views from ours. It's easy to get along with maybe people in this room, but maybe other people in our community it's a little more difficult. And so, because we are students of New Thought, this is kind of a new Unity Teaching Center, at least that's the way it has started off, and a lot of the lessons that we get are from New Thought teachers. We know how powerful our thoughts are, and we've learned that we have the power to control the thoughts that we have and how they flow, right? Okay, that's what we learn and that's what we try to do. And we know how all of that can make a difference in terms of how our day goes and our relationships and overall our lives. So I want to tell you about this idea of a mind free of bias. I hope you're open, just consider it. You may not agree initially with some of the things I suggest, but let's just give it a try. This mind free of bias and how it can help overcome obstacles by showing alternative ways of thinking about a given situation. This philosophy called Rame. It's really an attitude. It's not just a word, it's not just a philosophy, it's an attitude. And we can break it down into really 4 different pieces. The different qualities that individuals can develop around this. And each one of these qualities will strengthen you to be able to be more successful in the next quality. It's sort of growing, personal growth. And that first quality is tolerance. We all believe that we are tolerant people. And tolerance is based on mutual respect, isn't it? Yeah. And if I don't have this type of tolerance based on mutual respect, then I tend to be openly antagonistic toward people who hold different views. And we can easily get drawn into that. If we cling very strongly to our own beliefs and feel threatened by the mere presence of another's viewpoint, well, we can't be tolerant. And so we need to loosen the grip in order to be able to communicate with people who differ from us in a meaningful way. We want to have any communication. So developing tolerance, according to this teaching, is based on developing respect for another. And respect means being able to connect with the other person. And it means even if we don't agree with their viewpoints, we can still value their right to hold those viewpoints, even if they're not ones that we like or agree with or think have any value. That's the beginning. The key is separating the validity of the idea from the validity of the person holding the viewpoint, isn't it? We don't agree with their idea, but they're still valid as a human being. And behind every idea, their ideas and our ideas, is a thing called motivation. And motivation is shaped by our hopes and our fears. And if we're able to identify what the underlying motivation is, we usually see that the other person wishes to find happiness and be free from suffering. That's kind of a Buddhist philosophy for those who have studied any of that. And we want to be able to identify that and really recognize what's going on with the other person to some degree. We don't all want the same thing, or do we? Maybe we do all want the same thing, and there's a basic commonality of motivation that unites all of us as people. We just have different ways of going about getting that thing that we all want. If you connect with that basic motivation, then you begin to be able to establish a dialogue with someone. And it's what this tolerance, that first quality of this approach to life, tolerance makes it possible to establish that basic connection with the other person. And when you have that possibility then communication can begin. When I say communication, the transmission of ideas and the receiving of ideas. It's not just talking at another person, it's listening to them as well. So we start with tolerance, and then that builds to being able to receive their ideas. And so the second quality of this Rame philosophy is receptivity. tolerance, and then receptivity. Creating a space in your mind for new ideas. And as long as our minds are full and solid, we really can't have the ability to acquire new ideas and to really take it in. We're not able to learn if we're solid and our mind we think is full. But the mind is not full. None of our minds are full because they're infinite in nature, right? We know this. And we have the capacity to accommodate a lot in these heads of ours, in these minds of ours, unless we box it in and make it solid. In that case, we're closed off. Then it can't grow. So the lesson for creating this second quality, receptivity, is to cultivate a mind that is humble and non-grasping. Humility, the first piece of this, begins to counteract the pride that tells us that we know everything. And when we're humble, we're able to recognize the potential for learning from any given situation, and it becomes a lot easier to open ourselves up to what's being communicated. And then having this mind of non-grasping means that we have the capacity to simply observe what's happening without being caught up in judgment or discursive thoughts, our own thoughts, about what the other person is saying or what you're hearing. And we can develop this kind of mind through a couple of things that we're already doing. Meditation, for one, and then there's mindfulness practices. I'm sure that all of you do one or the other. When our minds are not grasping and judging, then our perspective isn't so narrow and fixed, and we can be more receptive, that second quality. And as the mind is opened more and more, we're naturally influenced by the information that we're taking in. And we take in that new information and we kind of begin to measure it by the knowledge, the information that we already have. And at that point you have a choice. You can either disregard that new information, say, nope, don't like that, throw it away, or, and in that case, you're finished. You're finished with this developing this attitude. Or you can choose to actively try to understand the implications of that new information. And if that's my choice, then I'm ready for the next step. And the third quality, the tolerance, receptivity, the third quality is curiosity. Curiosity. And that means having an inquisitive mind that desires to understand the other. It's a mind that asks questions, and when we ask questions, we get answers. Well, a lot of times we don't ask questions, and people need to be asked. Why do you feel this way? A curious mind doesn't just settle for knowing that our ideas conflict, for example, and they will. When a curious mind sees two conflicting ideas, then it wants to understand what ideas make more sense. So it asks questions, but it asks them with that mutual respect, bringing in the tolerance and the humility, and having an open mind. So a curious mind doesn't just passively absorb things, but it engages every opportunity as if it's kind of a giant puzzle. And a curious mind tries to work things out, and it kind of revels in the challenge of trying to work these ideas out. Everything becomes fascinating because everything has the capacity to teach us something. Everything. Especially those things we disagree with. So I've touched on these three qualities, the tolerance, and the receptivity, and the curiosity. And together, those three work really kind of like a powerful engine. And that engine is the ability, it helps you acquire information and try to understand different perspectives and values. And that provides a pretty unique opportunity in itself. Because the more you learn about these diverse perspectives and values and different approaches to problems, the more flexible your mind becomes. You can start to see how different ideas are more suited to or stem from different conditions in people's lives, or the knowledge that they have, or their education, their experience, the communities they come from. And when you have a better understanding of what's going on with the other person, then you're going to respond differently. You're going to respond maybe more appropriately. And rather than closing them off and having this active resistance to the thoughts, the words, you're more flexible about it. And so flexibility is the fourth quality of the Ramey philosophy. We are more flexible when we're able to perceive what's going on at any given moment. And we're able to be more discriminating in our responses to what's going on too, from a lot of different angles. And then we can also kind of stop clinging to one reality being the only reality, our reality. Our mind becomes more malleable, and we can adapt more easily to different situations and viewpoints and ideas if we have a more flexible mind. So developing this unbiased attitude, which is what Ramey is, doesn't just mean we think that all paths are equal. That's not what we're saying here at all. That's not true, because each of us has, each of the paths, each of the ideas that we encounter has its own flavor and strengths and weaknesses. It may not be our cup of tea, may not match with our own values. What we're trying to do is develop a greater awareness of what diversity has to offer. And the aim is to try to distinguish between different ways of looking at and approaching the world, and respecting each of those ways as a means that guides different beings, different individuals, toward their happiness. So let's take a couple of examples. My first example is a friend. Her name is Susan. And Susan has some very strong viewpoints about race relations. She's studied the history of civil rights. She's delved into the history and culture of the South. She's explored her own family history that included slave holdings. And all of that has inspired Susan, and a lot more, I'm sure, to ask the question, many questions, but this question of why. Why, for instance, did her ancestors over 150 years ago think that women should be educated, but black people should be owned? Why do some people today in this country, in our very community, believe that their own race is superior? Why? Well, as reprehensible as my friend finds racism and all that it represents in history and current events, she's able to have a civil conversation with a guy who owns the Rebel Shop in town. How many of you have seen the big sign for the Rebel Shop? Yeah, man. Yeah, man. She also had a civil conversation with another fellow who had an antique store and was carrying some Ku Klux Klan memorabilia. In each of these encounters, she approached the individual with respect. Tolerance for the intolerant, you might observe that to be, or not. She was open, and she was receptive to having a dialogue. She really had a curious mind, and still does. She had no idea what would come of the conversation, but at the very least, she knew that she was going to learn something from the encounter, right? Yeah. And so she engaged these people with an open mind, and I'm sure that was not an easy thing to do. But Susan is curious, that other quality. And she desires to understand why these individuals think it is okay to flaunt symbols. Symbols that you and I would consider advocate discrimination and maybe hatred, racial aggression, antagonism, and worse. But she decided to approach that dialogue without judgment and with some flexibility. She asked a lot of questions because that's how we learn about another. But she managed to do it in a non-judgmental way, at least on her outer part. And it opened up a dialogue with these people. And they told her just a little bit about their own stories. They answered her questions, and she began to understand a little better what was motivating these shop owners. They're trying to make some money, right? They were trying to make some money for the same reasons that you and I have been trying to make money all of our lives. To feed our families, to get nice things, to have security for our future, all those things. They didn't even necessarily consider themselves racist. More Southern history and culture buffs. Interesting. Now you say, but they're spreading and supporting racism, but that's not necessarily the point. That's not untrue, but that's not necessarily the point. My friend went into these encounters with all of her own understanding, her experience, her knowledge about race, and she managed to leave her own bias at the door. But she also managed to have a conversation, or at least open up a conversation with these folks. And I'm sure that if not then, in the future, she's going to get her 2 cents worth in a loving way too. So remember, Ramey is about having a mind free of bias. It's a particular attitude that helps people work with diversity in a way that supports their personal growth and promotes greater harmony. Well, she was doing that. Now I'm trying to apply the same philosophy to some of my own encounters right now. I'm one of the leaders in an organization called Georgia Forest Watch, and it's an environmental organization that protects and preserves and restores our national forest lands. And we got a lot of national forest lands here, and they're not necessarily protected just because our federal government has the Forest Service. Often I have to interact with the U.S. Forest Service and these personnel who have developed some plans to manage this land, in particular our foothills here. And that includes logging an additional 90,000 acres and applying herbicides to over 60,000 acres of national forest here in our area. The idea makes my skin crawl, maybe yours too. But I'm trying to get into these interactions with the individuals that have developed and proposed these plans in a way that, with respect, that allows me to connect with these officials with humility and with an open mind. I know that I'm approaching these interactions with humility because I don't have all the answers, but I also know they don't have all the answers either. So let's have some dialogue. And I'm receptive to their ideas, and I'm receptive and respectful of their experience. They're going to turn me right off if they perceive that I don't have respect for that. And so I'm also curious, so I'm formulating questions that don't attack them, but try to engage them and encourage them to share and explain why, really why, they're doing things a certain way or want to. So we're able to have a dialogue, and when that happens, I have a better opportunity of knowing what's really going on. It could be things going on politically, philosophically, personally, organizationally, and all that information lets me to be a little bit more flexible in my dealings with these folks, more adaptable, more nimble, and more strategic in my actions on behalf of the forest. But also that dialogue is going to sprinkle some seeds of another sort in those interactions with the people that I'm talking with too. It doesn't get fixed right away, and things don't get changed right away, and maybe they never will. But they change in me in terms of how I'm looking at this. So I've given you a couple of examples, and now I want you to develop your own example. And so this is not so much a meditation, but it's a mindfulness exercise that I want to take us through. It's only going to take a few minutes. So sit again. Just close your eyes for a moment and breathe. Try to establish a neutral mind. Kind of get rid of the thoughts right now. Just be for a moment. Breathe. And then let it out. And then breathe again. Do this 3 times. 3 good breaths. Now, if you would, identify a person who holds a different viewpoint from your own. It can be a neighbor with different politics. It can be a family member with different values. It can be the man I met in Tiger who truly believes that the world is flat. But make it someone who provokes a feeling of aversion, even if you even have to consider speaking to them. Now you got that? You got somebody in mind? Or are you all Mother Teresa and whatever? Now imagine that this person that you so disagree with, approaches you on the street and starts a conversation. Now observe how you feel as that begins. How do you feel? Do you detect barriers between you and that other person? Do you have any resistance to listening to the ideas that they've been espousing? Get a sense of your own closed-off mindset. How do you feel in your gut, and your heart, and your head? Now bring this awareness to the present moment in the scenario. In other words, right here and now. You're sitting here at the chapel. When you encounter this person, focus on what's really happening here and now in your head with this other person. What's happening here and now, and that means release the history you have with the person or the ideology, and simply observe what's being said in the moment. Try to let go of any expectation of where this conversation that you're beginning to have with this individual may lead. Stay in the present, engaged, aware of what's going on with your own body, with your own breath, and theirs. And how does that change the scenario that you're within right now, that you've created? Now consider what is appearing to you right now, this person I mean. A person who has unique hopes, unique dreams, unique experiences, a person who is one of a kind. There's no one else who has the exact same perspective on life that this person has, and right now, this person is right here talking to you. How would this encounter teach you something? Think about the potential not merely in terms of the factual information that might be exchanged, but also in terms of who you are as a person and how you react to different things, this thing specifically. And run through the scenario again and imagine a little different ways in that you could really make the most of the situation. Rest in any of the insights that might arise, and just take another moment to breathe through this and think about it for just a moment. Okay, let's open our eyes now. Come on back. We don't want to spend too much time with this person, do we? Okay. Does anybody have, from that experience, anything you want to share? Just from that experience. Yeah, Mimi.
I'm aware that, and this just brought it more clearly into light. When I find myself reacting to the person I imagined or any other, I have to acknowledge that what about them bothers me is something that is part of me. It's my shadow self. Mm-hmm. And so it can become a learning, or at least a more awareness encounter from that perspective.
Mary, did you have something you wanted to say? Okay, you were just trying to listen. Mimi said that when she gets into a situation with somebody, that kind of encounter, she's reminded that her reaction to that is because there's a shadow self, and there's a reflection there going on, and that's being very honest as well. That's another way of looking at it. Sandy.
I noticed that person that I was thinking about has so much in common with me, in addition to the things that we have in opposition, that they have a lot of the same desires, live their life the same way,
Yeah.
have hopes and dreams. So
Yeah.
see their likenesses as well.
Ruth?
I noticed that when I met the person on the street and they started talking, my whole body seemed to tighten up, and it's just like you're going, okay, I'm going to get through this. And the second that I decided to drop my belief, which is in essence in opposition to theirs, the second that I decided to drop that and simply be curious and receptive, my whole body went, and then they could speak, and it was just information and in them sharing themselves.
Because don't we create this energetic barrier, and then when you drop that barrier, the energy changes entirely, the vibration changes entirely around you. Anyone else? Hey, Chuck.
Yeah, if you think about it, when you feel that resistance, sometimes it's worth just taking on a compassionate role of where these people are, what's going on. And then it helps you understand a little bit more about what's going on in their head.
Yeah. None of this is new, but it's just kind of a different formula for approaching it and working on it within ourselves. So Ramey is about having this mind free of bias. It's an attitude. Tolerance, receptivity, curiosity, and flexibility are the qualities that are to be cultivated to develop that mind free of bias. And it's not easy. It's not easy for me, and it's probably not easy for most of you either. It takes work, but when we bring these qualities together, then I think it can help us with diversity in a way that supports our personal development in our own lives and really promotes greater harmony with those who hold different viewpoints.